We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Tim Harris. Tim Harris is founder and executive director of Real Change News. Tim, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Happy to be here.
So start out, tell us about Real Change News.
Sure. Real Change is a street newspaper. We have on a typical month about 350 homeless and low-income people who are out making a living selling the paper in the greater Seattle area. Our mission is to provide opportunity and a voice for homeless and low-income people while taking action for economic justice.
All right. And you also have you serve beyond just the paper. You also have issues that Real Change focuses on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're very much an activist organization, and most recently we've been focused on increasing the survival alternatives that are available to homeless people, and supporting self-organized tent cities. Various survival alternatives that homeless folks are engaged in creating themselves.
All right. And how much, when you are a Real Change vendor, talk about what that brings to a person?
Mm-hmm. The way it works is real simple. We think of it as a low threshold employment program that operates on a kind of a harm reduction model. Anybody who wants to sell the paper can come to an orientation and begin more or less immediately. The orientation takes about an hour. At the end of that, they get their first 10 papers for free. And their badge, they can go out, start selling the paper right away. After that, the papers cost them 35 cents each up front, and they sell it for the dollar cover price, and they keep everything they make. And people with tips tend to average about $1.25 that they make on every paper that they sell. And, you know, over the years, I've come to see the most important thing about selling the paper is the relationships that get created while people are out there on the street. I think that is incredibly powerful, and I've come to see, you know, each vendor as this sort of little hub of relationships. A lot of people, by the time they come to sell the paper, they've been through some pretty tough times, and they've come to a pretty isolated place, and they've often internalized a lot of the kind of negative messages that people get when they're homeless about not mattering and you know, not having a whole lot of value as a person. People start to believe that about themselves after a while. And what's really cool about the paper is when people are out there selling the paper, they have dozens, if not hundreds, of positive interactions with their readers every day. And people really get to know them and to care about them. And as people are sort of surrounded by this caring community of readers having these interactions numerous times a day, they come to think about themselves differently and take themselves more seriously and really see themselves as people who have value, who are capable of changing their lives for the better. And a lot of times they do. And it's really an amazing process to watch. I can never really quite get my head around it.
Another interesting item from your paper that I couldn't quite get my head around is that your circulation is so high that I believe you told me last time you were on the show that you put practically $1 million a year out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We do put about $1 million, more than $1 million a year directly into the pockets of the folks who sell the paper. We're a weekly newspaper, and we are selling between 18 and 20,000 copies of the paper every week. And, you know, over the course of the year, that comes to more than $1 million.
All right. So last time you were here, you talked about the 10-year plan, the King County 10-year plan. And I know this last year, I believe you had at least 2 different Occupy events at Westlake and perhaps at City Hall as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we've been pretty relentlessly focused on the Committee to End Homelessness in King County in our organizing, and those are the folks that run the 10-year plan to end homelessness in Seattle, King County. CEHKC. We've been doing this thing called the Occupy CEHKC campaign, and we've had 3 overnight campouts with homeless folks and their supporters in either Westlake Park or Victor Steinbrook Park. And then in the morning, we have gone to the quarterly governing board meeting of CEHKC. And, the issue that we have been bringing to them is the dire need for additional emergency shelter and other survival alternatives in Seattle. Since the plan has started, the first full year of the plan was in 2006. And since the plan began, the number of homeless folks in shelters alone has increased by 7%, and the number of people counted in King County out on the street after the shelters are full during the official one-night count that happens every January has gone up by 33%. So, over that time, the increase in the amount of emergency shelter has been quite negligible. And the reason for that is that, according to the policy of the Committee to End Homelessness, providing housing is the answer to homelessness, and shelter takes us in the wrong direction. So they've drawn this kind of a hard line against providing more emergency shelter, despite the rising numbers of homeless people who are unserved. So over the last year, we've been very much in their faces about that, asking them to support the safety and survival of homeless people on the street tonight. And it's been very encouraging because they've clearly heard us, and they're in the process of a policy shift to support more immediate survival solutions. They're coming to grips with the fact that people are becoming homeless more quickly than they are able to provide service enhanced housing alternatives to get people out of homelessness. There was this moment during the last governing board meeting that I think wasn't lost on anybody, and they were going through their sort of dashboard metrics that they have at the beginning of the meeting, where they talk about the various ways in which their work is succeeding and how they back it up with numbers. And it's people that they're getting into housing, the rate of those people that become homeless again, that sort of thing. And the numbers are looking fairly encouraging. And then they get to this number, which they've just recently started tracking, of how many people are newly homeless over the last quarter. And that's how many new names have shown up in their HMIS data collection system that anybody that goes to a shelter needs to register with. How many of those folks have shown up over the last 3 months? And what they had was 175 new families who had become homeless and 1,000 individuals just over the last 3 months, people whose names hadn't been in the system previously. So that is an enormous amount of people. And, it became clear to them and really everybody that people are being dumped onto the street by various economic factors that are creating mass homelessness faster than the human services industry can get people out of homelessness. And that's a huge issue. And, they've been kind of in denial about that, but they're starting to come to grips with it.
And so do you think they're pursuing now meaningful change to address that yet?
Well, I'm trying to be hopeful. What happened in the last session was they approved some new funding on the city level for shelter for individual homeless women and families, and they approved some new funding for day services, so people have somewhere to go during the day, and for some expanded hygiene services. It was about $500,000 in additional funding for these services that they approved altogether. Compared to what's needed, that's a teeny drop in the bucket, but it is the first time for, in my memory, since the 10-year plan started, that they've meaningfully expanded shelter at all. And they're creating a new policy document right now about how they're going to address this gap in shelter by expanding the emergency survival alternatives. And that's going to be released at their next governing board meeting.
Which is when?
Which is January 23rd. And we are going to be there, of course. We're keeping the pressure on with the Occupy CEHKC campaign. And what we're doing this time is we are inviting people to come stay at one of the tent cities in Seattle or on the east side, to come and stay at one of those tent cities overnight in solidarity with the folks who are camping out. And we're also doing a sort of a material aid campaign where we're inviting people to bring things like tents and sleeping bags and blankets and firewood, things that the tent cities need, and bring that along with them to organize a sort of a material aid drive so that people can bring that stuff with them, stay overnight, and in the morning car caravan with us downtown to attend the quarterly governing board meeting of CEHKC. And the reason that we're doing that is we don't think that it's enough to just simply create 20 more, 50 more, even 100 more emergency shelter beds, because last year when they did the one-night count, after the shelters were full, there were 2,594 people counted out on the street trying to survive after the shelters were already filled, and that number probably isn't going to change a whole lot this January when they do the count again. And we're really trying to encourage them to do more to support the sorts of self-organized survival alternatives that homeless folks are organizing themselves. The tent cities, we think, are a model for providing shelter that really goes beyond the simple act of providing emergency shelter and keeping people safe, and helps to build connections between the community and homeless folks, is dignity enhancing for the people who are staying there. It lends itself to the kinds of movement building that we need to be engaged in with homeless people and with the broader community. So, the tent cities are a survival solution that really lend themselves to organizing and movement building and creating the kind of movement for poor people's survival and economic justice that we need to turn things around. And we think that the Committee to End Homelessness needs to be much more supportive of these homeless organized survival communities, and work with them in a sort of a harm reduction model, as opposed to merely tolerating their existence, which is kind of the status quo right now.
Who makes up the Committee to End Homelessness here locally?
The governing board is leaders in human services and government and foundations, sort of big philanthropy like the Gates Foundation, United Way, some of the larger human services organizations have representatives on it. There's some folks from the local business community. Dan Bretler, who's the CEO of Car Toys, the president of the Committee to End Homelessness. So the governing board is, the decision-making body, and, the mayor's on it, the county executive's on it, some city council members, some mayors from and city council people from other municipalities in King County. So that's the leadership council, and then the interagency council is larger. There's probably about 40 people or 40 organizations that are represented in that, and it's fairly human services heavy. I think the majority of the membership of the Committee to End Homelessness is supportive of expanding emergency shelter, and that it's actually, a kind of a minority, a very powerful minority within the Committee to End Homelessness that has been really kind of holding the line against that, and that's changing.
So, and how have they been doing, setting the shelter issue aside, how have they been doing on their primary goal of just more affordable homes with services?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the theory behind the 10-year plan to end homelessness is that if you provide services, if you get chronically homeless people into housing first is the model. It posits that if you get somebody who's chronically homeless into housing with services, that it's much more humane and cost effective to do that and gets them on the road to independence than having them on the shelters and sort of cycling through emergency rooms and jails and that sort of thing. It's the idea that housing plus services is cheaper and better for everybody than having people be in homeless shelters. And if you target resources to the people who need the services most, the chronically homeless people who have been on the street for a long time and often have multiple issues that are keeping them there, that you take a lot of pressure off of the shelter system by pulling the people out who are pulling the most resources, and then you're able to focus those resources on people who are more easily housed. And, over time you eliminate homelessness by taking the folks out of the system who are toughest to serve first and creating capacity to help other people. It's not a bad theory if it were adequately funded. But it's nowhere near adequately funded. And by their own metric, I mean, their plan was to create. They had identified roughly, I forget how many people they'd identified who were chronically homeless, but the solution was to, over 10 years, create or maintain 8,000 new units of housing. Not all new units. Some of those were preserved, to create or preserve 8,000 units of housing with services. And they're, after 7 years, they're a little better than halfway there. And their projections for getting the rest of the way are not particularly encouraging, because the funding for new housing has been difficult for a while. The pipeline is pretty much frozen. And nobody anticipates that spigot is going to be opening up anytime soon. So they're just simply unable to provide enough housing and services to move people off the streets quickly enough to be able to actually reduce the number of homeless people that are out there. The good news is that there are programs out there that are really working, like the 1811 Eastlake program, which allows people who are chronic alcoholics to be able to get into housing and receive services while they're still drinking, and gets them off the street and into a safer environment. And a lot of times they reduce their drinking and sometimes actually stop. And it gets them off the streets and out of the shelters and into a more humane situation. But, they opened 1811 Eastlake like 6 years ago, and there hasn't been anything like it since, and it serves a pretty limited number of people. There needs to be another half dozen of those programs, and there needs to be, much more affordable housing than they're able to provide right now. I think the idea that you can solve homelessness through a human services response alone is incredibly misguided. And that, if the Committee to End Homelessness is really serious about ending homelessness, that they need to be talking more about what an economic justice response to ending homelessness looks like, and what is their strategy for building a movement to end homelessness. They often talk about creating the political will to end homelessness, but I don't see them really building the movement that it's going to take, or harnessing the kind of moral outrage that people justifiably have around homelessness, and sort of channeling that towards the broad economic justice solutions that we need.
And what do you see as the major impediment towards them doing that movement? Is that that core group of people you were talking about previously within the
it comes
committee?
down to institutional self-interest. I mean, the foundations in the United States, less than 1% of their overall funding goes to supporting organizing. And, there's a reason for that. I mean, it's not entirely black and white. There's exceptions to every rule. But, the Gates Foundation isn't particularly interested in deep, long-term structural change to the economy. They're about mitigating misery at best, not structural change. Seattle Foundation, United Way, I mean, these are not organizations that are known for their radical economic critiques, So, that's part of the problem. And I think when you have this coalition of big human service providers that are dependent on, a lot of government and foundation funding, they're not gonna go off the ranch. And you have the big foundations, and you have, government actors like the mayor and the county executive. The outside the box solutions are not going to come from a group that looks like that. It's their approach to homelessness is very depoliticized, and human services oriented, and it's where they've got the sort of consensus to operate. And, that's why it's important for folks like us who are outside of that system and are able to take those kinds of political risks and push for that kind of change. That's why it's important for us to, push them in that direction, because, they're only going to go there kicking and screaming.
Just about 5 minutes left. Talk about the latest pushback coming from the city of Seattle and the different chambers and business interests that are...
Yeah, that's kind of a mixed bag. It started off being really, really annoying, and it has become more hopeful. So the Seattle Convention Center and Visitors Bureau recently, it's been about 2 months now, launched this thing called the See It, Send It campaign. And, it's the latest bid for more quality of life ordinances and cleaning up the downtown, pushing the panhandlers out of sight and that sort of thing. And they're talking about how, undesirable activity on the streets in the downtown is threatening tourism and commerce. And it's a issue that sort of rears its head cyclically. Last time was when Tim Burgess tried to get through an aggressive panhandling ordinance that we were able to defeat with the mayor's veto. And their idea was to take photos of various forms of street disorder, and send them to electeds in Seattle every day. And their narrative was that, tourism is regaining a fragile foothold in our economy and is threatened by homeless folks and people trying to get people to sign petitions and youth with pit bulls downtown who are all very threatening and scary and keeping people away. And it's really interesting because it's very much the sort of manufacturing of a problem. I mean, every municipality has issues with things downtown that make people nervous, but Seattle is actually doing really, really well. If you look at the internal press of the tourism industry, they're predicting that 2013 is going to be probably a record-breaking year for tourism. Based on registrations at the Washington Convention Center alone, they're showing that 2013 is going to be a huge year. And Travel and Leisure Magazine does an annual survey of tourists, asking them, to rate various cities, the top 35 cities. And in that survey, Seattle comes up as number 11 as safest cities and number 8 as cleanest cities. So, this notion they have of street disorder threatening tourism is not entirely credible. And, I think they're just pushing to get the poor people out of the way so that when all of these tourists come, they've got this sort of, sanitized city that grandma's going to be entirely comfortable in. And really maximizing their profits around that. So that part's annoying, but the encouraging thing is that the mayor has convened this Center City roundtable that has downtown folks and human service providers really talking to each other about what the real problems are and how we can work together to solve them, and how it's not just as simple as having the police make more arrests or issuing more tickets, how these are just very kind of cosmetic solutions that don't do anything long term. And how, if we really want to do something meaningful, that looks like more funding for mental health services. It looks like better treatment options for drug and alcohol addiction. It looks like third spaces for poor people to be downtown when they're not in the shelters or not in their low-income housing downtown, places for them to go that are an alternative to just kind of hanging out in the street with nothing to do. And, people are really listening to each other and understanding each other. And it, looks like there is some momentum for real solutions to these issues that are long-term and actually going to be helpful instead of making things worse.
All right. Well, with that, we are just about out of time. We are talking with Tim Harris. He is founder and executive director of Real Change News. And how can people find Real Change News?
We are at realchangenews.org or at a street corner near you.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
My pleasure.